In this video, I'm going to be talking about the band and self-titled album by Badlands. This band was around in the late 80s and early 90s, and they only have 3 albums, but the band has a lot of history. The members were connected to bands and artists such as Ozzy Osbourne, Black Sabbath, and Kiss. It was founded by former Ozzy Osbourne guitarist Jakey Lee, former Black Sabbath vocalist Ray Gillen, and drummer Eric Singer, as well as former Surgical Steel bass player Greg Chaisson. Eric Singer was only on 1 album and was replaced by Jeff Martin. The band did not sound like any of the aforementioned bands, though. They were a blues-based hard rock band. I read some sources comparing them to AC/DC, but to me they were just a hard rock band. In my opinion, they sound like a classic rock band. So for example, the song Winter's Call reminded me of a Led Zeppelin type of song, and later I'll get more into their sound. The album was released on May 11, 1989, and it is celebrating 35 years. Now you may be wondering why I chose to do a video on a band that seems to have been forgotten over the years. Well, it's for 2 reasons. One reason is that I had the CD when I was younger, and it was an album I used to listen to often. Secondly, it was the band, or it was the first band that I ever saw live. Their first tour was with the bands White Lion and Tesla. I was a freshman in college. I got together with a few friends and we saw the concert at the Mid-Hudson Civic Center in Poughkeepsie, New York. Badlands was the first band to come on stage, so I remember the feeling of seeing a band up on stage right in front of me. It was an experience I would never forget. Let me get more into the history of this band. As I mentioned before, Jakey Lee played guitar with Ozzy Osbourne. He was on 2 albums in the early 80s, Bark at the Moon and The Ultimate Sin. Last year I did a video on Bark at the Moon, and I explained how Sharon Osbourne didn't really give Jakey Lee songwriting credits for that album. I'll put a link to it in the end screen, and I'll stick a link to it in the video description. Basically what that video says is that Sharon fucked him over, and she eventually fired him after the Ultimate Sin tour. What's interesting is that when he got fired, he found out about it through his roommate and guitar tech. Then he called Sharon personally, and then she said, "Yes, you're fired." So Jakey Lee decided to form his own band. At first, he's looking for a singer. He wanted someone who had stage presence and was a good frontman, so he approached Ray Gillen. Now, Ray Gillen was someone who knew what it was like to be fucked over by a big name rock band. So you see, back in 1986, Black Sabbath had just started touring for their 7th Star album. That was the album with Glenn Hughes on vocals. One night, Glenn Hughes gets into a fist fight and loses his voice after getting punched in the throat. So Ray Gillen was offered to sing with Black Sabbath. This also meant that he had to leave his current band called Rondinelli, which is a band that included Bobby Rondinelli, a drummer who was in lots of bands like Rainbow and Blue Oyster Cult, but I don't want to get off track. Back to Ray Gillen. At this point in time, Black Sabbath are getting ready to record the next album called The Eternal Idol, but unfortunately, Ray Gillen didn't seem to be a good fit for the band, and the band was suffering from poor management. So he left Black Sabbath, but here's where the story gets interesting. At that time, Eric Singer was the drummer for Black Sabbath, and he also quit. So eventually, they would both decide to join Badlands. And if you're wondering what happened with The Eternal Idol, the band recruited Tony Martin to re-record all the vocals. Supposedly there's a bootleg version of The Eternal Idol out there with Ray Gillen on vocals. Back to the band, Badlands. So the band has a bass player named Greg Chaisson, another guy who did not always have good luck with the bands he played in. Back in the early 80s, he moved to Los Angeles. He joined a heavy metal band called Steeler, but then he was replaced by his younger brother, Kenny. After that, the band became more well-known. They turned into the heavy metal band called Keel. He would later play with a number of metal bands, but he wanted to make it big. So he auditioned for Ozzy Osbourne's band, but he did not get the spot. But luckily, this is where he met Jakey Lee. So years later, Jakey Lee would invite him to play in Badlands. Now let's talk about the self-titled album by Badlands. When this album came out, the band was put into a category of a metal band along with the other glam metal bands at this time, but they were more of a blues-based hard rock band. I would even say that they were influential, as bands like Cinderella and Poison began to adopt this style after a few years after this release. Songs were even played on Headbangers Ball, if my memory serves me. I think it was the song Winter's Call that caught my attention. This was a song that sounded like Led Zeppelin, but not so much that they were criticized for it. There was another band back then that got called out for doing that. They were named Kingdom Come. They were actually the original Led Zeppelin clones, way before Greta Van Fleet. But back to Badlands. Winter's Call was a beautiful blues rock song with acoustic guitars and catchy melodies. The song was also preceded by an acoustic instrumental called Jade's Song. So if you listen to the album in full or on the CD or on the vinyl, it was like an extended version of the song. There were lots of other good songs on the album. The opening track was called Highwire. This has some awesome Jakey Lee guitar riffs. Sound like the stuff he played in Ozzy, but they were catchy riffs. There were other songs on the album that were typical hard rock anthems. Songs like Dancing on the Edge and Hard Driver. Those were pretty cool songs. But then there were other tracks that sounded like stuff that came from the 70s. There were the bluesier numbers like Streets Cry Freedom and Rumblin' Train. Those songs had a sound reminiscent of classic rock bands. A band like Bad Company comes to mind. They also had another single called Dreams in the Dark. This was actually the first single, and that one also had some amazing guitar work by Jakey Lee, and the vocals by Ray Gillen were somewhere between like Robert Plant and David Coverdale. Let me also mention one of my favorite tracks in the album. That's the closer, called Seasons. It reminded me of some classic rock from the 70s with the slow acoustic guitar intro and the vocals that slowly build into some powerful arena rock vocals. I felt that was one of the most emotional songs on the album. Now you may be wondering whatever happened to this band. After their self-titled debut, Eric Singer was fired from the band, but that happened to be a blessing in disguise because he went on to play in Paul Stanley's solo band. But then later he was offered a spot in Kiss when Eric Carr died. So after that, Badlands gets a new drummer named Jeff Martin. He was the vocalist for Racer X, but he also had connections with the bass player Greg Chasson, as they were in a few bands together. But then things started to take a turn for the worse. The band was in conflict with Atlantic Records about the direction of the music, and then things got even worse than that. Ray Gillen was diagnosed with AIDS. He started to get very thin and looked unhealthy. They released another album in 1991 called Voodoo Highway. After that album, Ray Gillen left the band in 1992. Badlands tried to find a new singer, but they considered a few people, but eventually they were all dropped, or eventually the band was dropped by Atlantic Records. This was also when grunge was taking over and metal bands were not as popular. Ray Gillen played in a few bands after that, but then on December 1st, 1993, he died from his disease. They eventually released an album called Dusk in 1998. It was a collection of demos recorded between 1992 and 1993. Many of these songs would emerge in like different forms in various projects from the other band members. So that's all. Let me know your thoughts on this band. Check out this video right here. Please subscribe if you have not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. I also do a lot of these history-based retro reviews, and I try to do it when an album celebrates an anniversary. That is all. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.